How's everybody doing? So this is going to be a really fun panel, I think. Just by way of background, we've been talking a lot about, the transformations we've seen with the web over the last 20 years, and we've really seen it transform from this kind of esoteric system for publishing technical notes to really being kind of a bedrock for a lot of what we do with commerce and education and social interaction today. And a lot of that has really been facilitated and driven by the rise of services that make the web easier to use. So hosting platforms, publishing platforms that make really any everyday person somebody who can very easily kind of interact with and share content, look at content online, which has been awesome. But at the same time, kind of the rise of these services has also driven this rise in centralization we keep talking about. So most people in this group, I think, probably take at face value kind of this premise that, centralization is kind of a bad thing in and of itself. But for a lot of people outside of this room, that's not going to be very intuitive to talk about. People aren't going to, getting behind this banner of re-decentralizing the web anytime soon. But if you talk about something, maybe with your more politically oriented friends around censorship in China or Russia, that might, start ringing some bells. But what we've found, personally in my own work too, is if you start talking about something like identity theft, the fastest growing crime in the world, how many people in this room have been impacted by identity theft in some form or fashion? Most people have. 1 in 3 Americans have been directly kind of victims of identity theft. I only have the stats for the US, but I can only imagine it's worse or about the same abroad. And a lot of that is really tied to the way that we've thought about handling and managing identity and naming on the web over the last couple of decades. We've got some of the people who are kind of on the front lines of thinking about how we could reimagine doing this kind of moving forward, and I'm going to give just some introductions of these guys. On the far left, your left, I guess, we've got Christopher Allen, one of the OGs in the room, somebody who's been kind of on the frontiers fighting and thinking about this stuff for a very long time. We were talking, he's got a diverse set of interests, everything from kind of like online gaming to kind of playing, are they called hand pan drums? So if you guys want to like jam after this, he might be the person to go to. But kind of the thing that kind of ties all these things together is this idea of kind of fostering collaboration and kind of grassroots-driven kind of communities and things like that. We've got Muneeb Ali right here in the middle, works on Blockstack. Muneeb was actually a PhD student at Princeton, kind of left a couple years ago now, I guess, to work on Blockstack. About a year ago, he went back to Princeton to kind of do a presentation on the progress they'd made on their project, which we'll learn about later. And his advisor actually said, I'm going to make a public bet saying that Muneeb's not going to come back. He's not going to finish his PhD because this project is so interesting. Actually, Muneeb's defending in about a month or so. Let's give him a round of applause. So you don't have to drop out of college to save the world. So
maybe that was a Jedi mind trick he was trying to do.
Next to Muneeb, we've got Joaquim here. Joaquim also used to be a pilot before he did this, and has been kind of at the forefront of kind of working on collaborative economies, been a leader of a group called WeShare, based in Europe, I think, but has spread kind of globally, is working on a program called YOLOCOM, something like this. And then here, closest to me is Jeremy Rand, who is one of the longest, most active members of a project called Namecoin. So we're going to be learning about all of these today. And maybe just to kick it off, I'm going to ask you guys first, let's start with problems. And I'd like to start with concrete, kind of intuitive problems. I'd love to go down the row and ask each of you to kind of give us one very brief anecdote that kind of illustrates some of the challenges we're facing today around naming and identity on the web. And then I'm going to follow up with that to ask you to please just give us 2 or 3 sentences specifically on your project and how it maybe is trying to address that problem. So Jeremy, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I guess one of the examples that I tell people when I'm trying to explain why Namecoin and naming generally matters is HTTPS. I'm sure you guys all use it. It's very centralized. There are these corporations called certificate authorities, and they are involved in certifying that a website really is who they says they are. And if a certificate authority either gets compromised or gets coerced or just is evil, they can issue false certificates, and these can let websites be impersonated. And this has actually happened. There was one really high-profile case a few years ago. A large certificate authority got compromised. The IP address who did the compromise traced to Iran. It may have been Iranian intelligence. And the certificates that were fraudulently issued were for websites such as Google, Mozilla, Skype, Gmail, lots of things that you really do not want Iranian intelligence agencies, or for that matter, any intelligence agency, to be able to impersonate at will. And the certificates that were issued were found to be in use on an Iranian web server. And the certificate authority that was compromised did not notice that any of this had happened for over a month. And I think that's really problematic. And Namecoin and naming systems in general that are more secure, I think can make this kind of attack a lot more difficult. Okay, do you want me to talk about my thing now as well?
Yeah, sure. Just like 1 or 2 sentences about Namecoin.
Sure.
Would be helpful.
Yeah, so Namecoin is a modified version of Bitcoin, which basically repurposes Bitcoin to be used as a naming system rather than a currency. Its most common use right now is as a decentralized DNS system. And I think it's more suitable than the traditional DNS system because when the attacks such as fraudulently falsifying records, with Namecoin, that's basically equivalent to attacking Bitcoin, stealing Bitcoin, which is very difficult.
Great.
Yes, so how we look at it, it's like, centralization. A big problem is the fight over data. So we have a couple of big platforms that congregate as much data as possible. And there might be many, many cool services out there that we want to use, but our data sits with some of these huge third-party platforms, and we cannot use these services. So what we built is a multi-purpose client for the social link data graph, or also known as SOLID. It's a W3C standard developed by Tim Berners-Lee and his team. And what it does is that it decouples data and the application, and at its core is a user identity that provides authentication and control over the data.
Yeah, so one problem that kind of like stuck with me was I was actually sitting at a presentation by David Clark, the chief protocol architect of the internet. I think, Brewster, you should definitely try to get him here on the next one. And he was kind of like looking back at what the internet should have been or what went wrong. And he did this thought exercise that I think you guys should also do right now, that let's say you just want to go to Facebook and you launch your browser. In the time between you launch your browser and you type in facebook.com and you actually log in, how many trust points are actually there? How many parties and organizations are actually involved in that simple step that you do every day, that you're just blindly trusting? That yes, all of this are my trusted parties, and now I can, and all you're trying to do is I just want to know what my friends are up to, right? So, and that list turned out to be more than 10. And so something is wrong with the picture when you are trusting people that you don't even know exist, right? So our work with Blockstack kind of goes back to this notion that to really decentralize the web, you need to decentralize these trust points, which are currently inside this big bubble, and you don't even know about them. So what we are doing is that we are actually building this layer by layer, that first there's naming, then there's identity, and so on and so forth, and I'll talk more about it later. but it's a production system. We've actually been running it for more than 2 years. Recently, actually, Microsoft publicly announced that they are putting their weight behind this technology. They're going to help and develop it, and I'd love to talk more about it later on.
My name's Christopher Allen. I've been trying to address and solve these problems for a long time. I'm the co-author of TLS, and I can tell you stories about how that was an attempt to break some of the centralization that existed before. So centralization as a way of creeping in. Every new generation, there's a new kind of centralization that we have to worry about. We've got a lot of first world problems that we've talked about here, but I'm also very concerned about the underprivileged and where they fall and the issues that they have with identity. I teach in an MBA program, and one of my students went to Afghanistan to help young women become entrepreneurs. So she's, out there where, every few days there's a bomb or whatever, and she's dealing with a population that is, has a lot of issues with, leaders and other different communities saying, no, you can't do this. You can't participate in our world economy. So she's teaching them how to use smartphones and other types of devices. But there's a real risk that the Afghan authorities or various tribes will abuse this information. Another story, I'm involved with ID 2020, which is a UN event that happened last month, the first one on digital identity at the New York headquarters. And a service organization that works with refugees said that they had this wonderful facility that was warm and beds and dry and whatever, but it required a handprint to get in the facility. And they had refugees that were basically living in tents in the mud instead, because they feared that if the Syrians knew that the Syrian government knew that they were there, that they then may go persecute their loved ones back at home. So they were just very, very fearful of that identity information being abused and taken back for human rights abuse. I mean, the root of all of this is, back in the 1930s, Holland had the best civil service administration in the world. They really were able to take care of their citizens and deal with a lot of different types of issues that the government in a Northern European country wanted to do. They were invaded by the Germans, and as a consequence, more Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, etc., died as a percentage of population in Holland than they did in Germany, because they had all these wonderful records on everybody and who knew who. And one of the first things the Germans did was they went into every temple and grabbed all the temple records so they could grab things. And so today we actually know more about some of the Jewish temples before the World War II, because the Germans grabbed it all and took it back with them and preserved it. So these are some of the kinds of problems that I think we also have to worry about, and I do believe there are solutions for. But I just want to say, this also illustrates how hard these solutions are.
Great, thanks guys. I think you all really highlighted how important this is beyond just, preventing your little brother from signing into your Facebook account and writing something embarrassing on your wall. So the breadth and depth of this problem and topic is quite significant. Chris, I'm wondering if we can ask you, though, to kind of help give us a historical perspective on this. So what were some of the early decisions that we were making in the early days of the web that really kind of shaped the way we think about naming and identity today? And then can you walk us through some of the conversations? This conversation also isn't new, right? How has our thinking on this evolved over time? And what are the big challenges we've kind of seen pop up as we've tried to give more user control and agency in this equation?
Sure. So I'll start back with sort of my roots with TLS. There was a lot of competition for TLS. It was not clear that it was going to be the winner in the standards war. At that particular point, Visa and MasterCard had joined separate efforts together to basically do this. an entrenched patent holder basically had given a free license for yet another standard. And Microsoft had done their typical embrace and extend strategy where they had something that was just different enough that they could control it. So a lot of what allowed the community that built TLS to be successful was a story about decentralization, that we were basically not having one ring rule them all. That basically you could choose what certificate authority you wish to use. It was up to you. You could turn on and off different types of things, what is nowadays called trust agility. Well, we did succeed in that. It's the world's broadest deployed security standard, but centralization has cropped in again. We have fewer browsers. The browsers, to make it easy for us, give us less flexibility about turning on and off various certificate authorities. It's hard to understand. And even there was one browser where when you removed the certificate authority through some arcane thing, it would basically restore it the next time you did an update. So centralization creeps in, and I think this has been the ongoing story. Passport was an attempt by Microsoft to be federated so that we could have these silos that could talk to each other. But then nobody wanted Microsoft once again to be kind of the master of those silos. So the Liberty Alliance was created, and that was basically, then corporations could do it, but it didn't have individuals as kind of peers in this sense. It was only corporations could be members of Liberty Alliance. So in 2000, a group of people started working on the identity. It was the Internet Identity Workshop and Identity Commons formed to try to address some of these things, to allow people to be peers with corporations and do federation this way. But once again, out of that OpenID, OAuth, a lot of the standards that you use today are there. But if you look at Twitter's sign-on, you look at Facebook federated sign-ons, they're effectively using OpenID style work and OAuth. So what happened was an attempt to make us all be equals and be peers. Well, they decided, well, we're only going to do half of it. We're going to allow other people to use our stuff, but we're not going to allow other people to use our stuff. So again, centralization creeped in.
Great, yeah. And so maybe Joaquim and Jeremy, if you guys could speak a little bit, Chris just outlined for us, kind of this cycle we seem to be going through, the decentralization back to centralization, decentralization back through. I'm curious, what new technologies or developments are you guys seeing kind of on the horizon now that makes you think we might be able to break this cycle and kind of achieve what Brewster's been alluding to in terms of actually locking the web open at this layer? What specific kind of things drew you guys to this space, and what technologies are you using that you think might actually be the tipping point in a way that we haven't been able to achieve in the past?
Okay, so I think what I mentioned before, that the decoupling of data and the application is key, because it will be really a liberation for services, but also for competing companies and also for developers.
And sorry, what do we need to decouple data from the applications that use it?
So right now, when you look at a platform like Facebook, you have your user profile or identity, the application and the database all tied into one block, right? Mm-hmm. And this prevents people from using other services. And for instance, or even losing their complete data and their identity if the service closes down, or if the service closes your account, right? Mm-hmm.
Right. So what's new? You guys mentioned using Solid. What is Solid providing you guys that?
As Tim Berners-Lee earlier also explained, it's basically the data is not tied to the application. You just have your data somewhere, and you can exchange the application at any time. So you get the best application out there, or the one that you like the most, and you don't have to worry about your data. And but this also, it's for personal use cases, but it really becomes also important for initiatives in the sharing and collaborative economy, because data is not locked into silos where it's stuck. It can be used in, or reused for different purposes. And this is like something where data actually become a commons instead of that they are locked into a silo.
Okay, great. Muneeb, did you want to jump in?
This is a great question, so I wanted to like comment on it. So this is definitely a cycle in the sense of, like decentralization and centralization. You can think of this as a pendulum, keeps swinging like from one side to the other side. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not the first wave, right? Like in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of excitement in peer-to-peer systems. Right, and there are only few survivors, and they're actually sitting here. Like BitTorrent is one, Tor is another, right? And then there is a graveyard of dead projects. Like if you think that you're trying to decentralize DNS now, people were trying to do it back then as well using P2P. If you think you're trying to decentralize storage now, people were exactly trying to do these exact same things earlier as well, and literally there's a graveyard of these dead projects. And as a community, I think it's important for us to ask that question, that what has changed? What makes us think that we can be successful now when we weren't earlier? And for me, the biggest thing that has happened since then, and that was kind of like a trigger, is actually Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin has solved a very hard computer science problem, and its public infrastructure has been running for 7 years. There is a multi-billion-dollar bounty on finding bugs in Bitcoin. Like you can actually just go and steal money if there are actual problems with it. And what Bitcoin really solves is that even if you take something as simple as logging into something, you have to start somewhere, right? Who do you trust initially? Like where do you start? That's where these companies come in, that they will be like, yeah, I've just used Twitter's OAuth, right? And you can start from here. So Bitcoin actually gives you that neutral playing field that we never had. No one owns it. It's a neutral playing field. You can start off from there. You can have your public keys, private key mapping mapped on the blockchain. And from there, you can actually build these decentralized systems. So for me, that's the single most important thing that has happened, and which gives us hope that we can get it right this time around.
Yeah, and to build on what Muneeb said, there have been lots of attempts in the past to replace the certificate authority system that HTTPS uses. And I think one of the really big problems with all of those attempts so far, things like Dane, which stores the data in the DNS system rather than with certificate authorities, or things like Convergence, which use trust agility. The problem that they all have is they just shuffle around the trusted third parties. They don't actually remove the third party trust. And what Bitcoin really innovated on here is Bitcoin gives us a method of just getting rid of that third party trust completely. And so I think that's a game changer, I think.
Great, that's very helpful. Muneeb, I want to jump back to you too. So you guys with Blockstack have kind of gone through some evolutions in how you even kind of conceptualize the role of the blockchain in your solution. So you guys initially started on Namecoin, you've since moved to Bitcoin, but also kind of building in this kind of agnosticism to the systems that you're designing so that you have some flexibility moving forward that can kind of match the changes in this ecosystem as it grows. Can you just kind of walk us through some of that? Like, how we kind of move from this general kind of inclination to throw stuff on the blockchain to what you have today?
Right, absolutely. Actually, I think maybe I had a slide that we can display. Yeah.
I don't know if I can control that or not.
Sure. Let's see if we get it. But basically, if you look at this, it's very interesting that this is the CTO of Amazon, Werner Vogels. And this is an account that he made on our system, on Blockstack. It just looks like any website, right? Like an about.me kind of a page. The interesting thing about this website is that he owns his name, Werner.id, kind of like a domain name built on the Bitcoin blockchain. And to change even a single character, you will have to take down Bitcoin, which costs like a couple of $1 billion, right? There's no company in the middle. With that private key, Werner directly owns this profile. He can actually log into systems, like a new website, by just signing a quick message that, hey, I'm the owner of Werner.id, right? And this is live, this is in production. So we already have these abilities. And the question was about how our thinking has changed. So I think that's a very, very interesting question that theoretically we might think that certain things are possible or interesting. I actually am a firm believer in building production systems, and this is where the rubber actually meets the road, and you find out problems that you weren't thinking about initially. So one of the things that we learned is that we can't tie ourselves to any particular blockchain. Like if you're thinking of building like a self-archiving internet which should be there forever, we should design it in a way that it can run when Bitcoin fails, right? Or any other blockchain fails. So the architecture has to be designed that way. Another thing that we learned was you have to pay attention to the UX issues and performance issues from the get-go, right? People are not going to stop using the existing systems if your performance is worse or if your user interface is worse, right? It actually has to be better, right? And building these data center-based systems is actually hard enough. Like talk to Facebook engineers or Google engineers, and they will tell you what hard work they actually do to make those things scale. When you try to build same performance in a decentralized world, it actually becomes like much harder, right? So from a technical perspective, scaling these systems is actually harder, but it's worth fighting that fight.
Great. I'm going to